We now return to our Inara Commander series with Mack Winston, Season 2, Episode 7, Shindig. Lagerkvitz Gateway, Sintani. Finally, the time had come. The big ascension ceremony held at Zemina Torval's home station in Sintani. These ceremonies were held usually a couple of times a year, and those who had somehow distinguished themselves in service to the Empire were invited along. Therefore, it was a bit of a surprise that we were invited. Sure, I had reached the imperial rank of Baron through service to the East India Company, and this was, of course, the reason for our invite, but that's only because they paid me. The ranks came with the rations, as it were. I also had to admit that perhaps I hadn't been the best captain in the East India Company, and we'd become noteworthy, not so much for our successes, but for one or two of our bizarre failures, like the incident that ended up with fish raining down on that godforsaken planetary base that one time. But here we were, entering the grand ballroom, dressed immaculately in hand-tailored suits. The whole process had been a bit bizarre. First, getting the hand-tailored suit, not tat, bought online, Cal had admonished me. There was a tailor in the Hab Ring on Harvestport. It had been like stepping back into the 17th century, only betrayed by a lone datapad that lay unused on the counter. The wizened old tailor had fussed around me, and then a week later I'd gone to pick up the new suit, at very great expense. Cal told me I looked almost as sexy as Denton Petraeus. Damnation with faint praise indeed. I decided I would get him back later for that remark. The ceremony itself was pretty much as I imagined. The first half was dominated by self-important windbags making worthy speeches. It was amusing to look around the gathered company. The assembled imperial hierarchy all had expertly managed to wear a face that exuded interest while managing to actually be half asleep at the same time. I glanced over at Cal. Yep, he had the look down. After all, being a native Akinarian, he had probably endured these events dozens of times. The other delegates, like me, who didn't have a lifetime of practice listening to boring speeches, well, the yawns and glazed-over eyes said it all. But no one seemed to notice. Amongst the assembled bigwigs and upper-end dignitaries was the lady herself, the fearsome Zemina Torval. Her penetrating gaze scythed across the assembly. I made sure to look interested in the speech when it was her turn. The second half was a lot more interesting, and, well, we very nearly caused another incident. First came the food and drink. No expense had been spared, and we mingled with the Empire's richest, naturally with the best quality food and drink. It wasn't long until Cal and I were starting to get a bit drunk on the rather excellent wine. These events were, so I was told beforehand, a good opportunity to network, rub shoulders with those who'll give us lucrative work. Make the most of it, George Oppenheimer had reminded us back on Harvestport before we left. And so we were. I let Cal do the talking. He was, after all, from a disgustingly wealthy family in Akinar, and knew how to smooth talk these guys. Unexpectedly, it became my turn to make an introduction. I had been just picking yet another sample of the rather excellent sushi on offer when...
Commander Mack Winston, I've been looking forward to meeting you.
The source of the greeting was a rather imposing man of considerable size, wearing what was obviously an impressively expensive, hand-tailored suit made on the Imperial homeworld. Impressively expensive, but not at all overstated or gaudy. His voice was deep and booming to match his voluminous chest.
Admiral Darius Hendrickson.
He introduced himself. I wasn't sure what I had done to get the notice of an Imperial Admiral. Pleased to meet you, I said. This is Callum Vaz... I looked around for Cal. He'd been there seconds before. He had disappeared. Kez. I'm sorry, he must have slipped off. Well, pleased to meet you anyway. And we shook hands.
I knew your great-uncle, James Winston, very well. I was very saddened to hear of his untimely death. We met a few times at flight training conferences. I used to be the chief instructor for the Internal Security Service, at the same time that your great-uncle was running the flight academy at Dublin Citadel.
Well, that was a bit before my time, I'm afraid. But James Winston was Alliance, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. But we are not nearly as antagonistic as the media would have you believe.
Hendrickson replied slightly wistfully.
There were often conferences where we would meet up, and we struck up a good friendship despite our ideological differences. I was invited to your great-uncle's home on a few occasions for a private meal. I met your father, too, when he was just a lad.
I had a sudden flash of curiosity. I never knew my father, apart from very vague images from my very early childhood. You met my father? What was he like?
Oh? Very quiet. A studious lad, and, well, to be honest, a bit moody. He wanted to join the Alliance Science Council and become a pilot in the exploration wing. This was back in the days when we didn't have the modern friendship drive, and it took serious dedication to get anywhere. It's a tragedy that Norman Mosser got to him,
Hendrickson said, shaking his head sadly. I don't know much about my father's history. Well, except where he's mentioned a couple of times in the book, The Greatest Crimes of Norman Mosser by Phyllis Braun. I have his journals, but they're encrypted, and well, I have the key, but it's protected by a passphrase and I don't know it.
Well, maybe I can help you find what you're looking for. There's a mutual friend of ours who retired to XVA, and your great-uncle James had entrusted a significant amount of family data to his company. It might at least give you some pointers. I'll send him a message. He'll be willing to meet with you if I tell him that I met with you. He's become somewhat reclusive in his later years. You also might want to try Pan Gilmore if she's still alive. She was your great-uncle's partner for many years, although I gather she had a somewhat strained relationship with your father.
Thank you. That would be greatly appreciated. I noticed another man approaching us. I thought he looked a bit like Callum. Could it be?
Good evening, Admiral. I trust you are enjoying the ceremony.
He asked as he glided by.
Splendid evening. You have once again excelled with the catering. May I introduce the delegate from the East India Company, Commander Mack Winston.
Enrique Vazquez. Very pleased to meet you.
He said rather formally. That's why he looked like Callum. He must have been his brother. May I also compliment you on the evening? Absolutely top quality, I replied smoothly. And by the way, I think I might know your brother. Enrique scowled just for a few milliseconds, but it was enough to warn me not to mention that Cal was actually here. Well, here somewhere.
How very unfortunate.
Enrique remarked acidly.
Before you think of doing business with him, I suggest you ask him why he was forced to leave the family home.
He briefly fixed me with a penetrating stare, then turned on his heel and disappeared back into the party. I looked over at Hendrickson. Oops, I said weakly.
Don't worry about Enrique. What his brother did was deeply shameful, but...
The Admiral briefly looked up at the ceiling.
If I had a family like his, the temptation would be awfully strong to do the same.
We spent the next few minutes talking of trivialities, such as my own brief potted history as a foster child on Azaban, and my eventual escape from that awful planet, until the inevitable call of nature crept up on me. I excused myself and scanned the room for Cal as I went towards the washroom. I had to warn him that his brother had laid on the arrangements. The last thing I wanted was there to be some kind of altercation. Deputy Oppenheimer had warned us in no uncertain terms that there would be consequences if we caused any incidents that brought the EIC into disrepute. A fistfight between the organizer and his brother would, I reflected, be such an incident. I entered the rather plush lavatory by myself. I was therefore rather surprised to hear a hoarse whisper from one of the cubicles. "Mack!" came the urgent whisper. I turned around. Cal was peeping around the corner of a cubicle door. It seemed a bit comical as he beckoned me, half panicked. "What?" I asked in a normal voice. "I saw your brother here." Suddenly, Cal grabbed me by the wrist and dragged me into the cubicle and shut the door. "Hey!" Shh! I heard the washroom door open. I could hear 2 pairs of feet, and then the sound of a tap running. A sigh, and someone washing their hands.
Murdock, I think my brother might be here with that pilot from the East India Company.
Came the voice. It was Enrique.
Yes, sir.
We are going to look for him, and if we find him, we will have them both ejected. Very publicly, of course.
Yes, sir.
And then I'm going to write a protest, in the strongest of terms, to the East India Company, employing such a vile weasel of a man.
Spat Enrique with surprising anger. We stood, perched slightly ridiculously on the lid of the toilet, listening to this going on outside. With relief, we heard the 2 pairs of feet again as Enrique and Murdock left the washroom. I looked at Cal. "You know, you're going to tell me your life story on the way home. No more putting it off," I hissed at him.
"You've got to get me out of here,"
Cal pleaded. "Well, I can hardly just disappear with you now, can I? Enrique's going to be watching me like a hawk. You'll just have to lock yourself in here till it's all over."
"Don't you think he'll look in here? I'm surprised he didn't already,"
Cal hissed, panic in his voice. "Okay, I just met up with Admiral Hendrickson. He hinted that he's not really a fan of your family, and, well, it turns out he used to hobnob with my great-uncle. I'll see what I can do." Great. I'd have to already use up a favor with this guy I barely knew and a high-up in the Empire, the sort of person I desperately needed to impress if I wanted to keep bringing in the trade. It seemed to take an agonizing amount of time before I could get to Admiral Hendrickson alone. I kept catching glimpses of Enrique, whose beady eyes always seemed fixed in my direction. He had me at a disadvantage. I didn't know who Murdock was, but he'd obviously be looking out for me, too. "Admiral," I started out, "I have a bit of a problem." Hendrickson fixed me with a knowing smile.
He's here, isn't he?
"Yeah," I said, looking around shiftily, hiding in the washroom. We just had a rather awkward chat standing on the toilet seat, while Enrique was outside discussing with some guy called Murdock about having us publicly thrown out.
Murdock is his personal slave, I think.
Yeah, anyway, it won't go down very well back in Harvestport. I could really do with some help. Hendrickson waved at someone. Sliding out of the background, almost like a magical summoning, appeared the most glamorous woman I had ever seen.
Melinda, please keep Murdock occupied for a few minutes.
"With pleasure,"
she said smoothly and melted back into the crowd.
My personal assistant.
Hendrickson explained.
I trust her with my life.
He said with a wink.
And now I will go keep Enrique occupied. It won't be hard. There's an exit not 10 meters from the washroom. I suggest you let Callum slip out through there.
Hendrickson moved off towards Enrique. I made a point of not suddenly disappearing off to the washroom, instead availing myself to another glass of wine and making the motions as if I were about to talk to someone. Taking a few glances around the room, I noted that Hendrickson had engaged Enrique in conversation and had got him looking the other way. A couple of minutes later, I pushed Callum out the exit, unseen. I remained at the ceremony until the bitter end, so as not to draw any suspicion, hoping that Enrique Vazquez had finally become convinced that his brother wasn't actually there after all. Finally, relief. Perhaps we had dodged this particular bullet. Cal would have a lot of explaining to do when I got back to the ship. A lot of explaining.